Hello and welcome to our Freed Indeed Ministries case for case for a creator class. This is just like our Running Scared class. This is going to be a little bit different from the book clubs because it's going to be more a class format than a book club format. But for those of you watching in the pre-recorded sessions, it's not going to be fundamentally all too different for those of you who are just watching the recording. But with that said, we want to go through The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. So, as I mentioned, the last book that we did in our class was Running Scared by Edward T. Welch, which is an awesome book, and I really enjoyed doing our class on it. I really think that it was a very helpful and useful class, offering help for anxious people. It's a book that I find, frankly, life-changing. It's a book that I've read multiple times. In fact, by the time we were getting through to the end of our book club, you could see that my copy of the book was getting pretty beat up because it's just a book that I've gone back to time and again. So I highly recommend going back and watching that class as you're able. But in the meantime, today we are starting a new book study on The Case for a Creator. So the reason why I want to go through this book is because I think Lee Strobel does an excellent job in this book of showing not only that faith and science don't have to be opposed to one another. A lot of times people think that faith and science are enemies. I don't believe that faith and science are enemies. I certainly don't believe that they have to be. And I think Lee Strobel does an awesome job of demonstrating that. I also think that this book is very helpful because it's unique in that it really so I guess where I'm saying it's unique is that there have been lots of other books put out by credible scientific minds. Oftentimes it's actually people Lee Strobel is interviewing in this book, but there have been lots of books put out by different scientific people, and those books have demonstrated that different scientific disciplines are not at odds with the Christian faith and are in fact oftentimes very pointing towards realities that Christianity teaches. So, but what Lee Strobel has done that I think is quite unique, at least from what I've seen, is that since Lee Strobel uses his kind of journalistic background to go and interview these people, he's able to cover multiple disciplines of the scientific world and show how these multiple disciplines are actually confirming Christian truth claims, or at the very least are not going against Christianity. So because I think that Lee Strobel does a uniquely good job of presenting this, I think it's really worth going through this book and seeing what we can see from it. Now, a little bit of Lee Strobel's background is that Lee Strobel was actually an atheist. He was an atheist journalist for the Chicago Tribune, who particularly reported on legal matters. So he was a court journalist and had a degree in journalism, but also a degree in law. And so he did a lot of court reporting and these kinds of things. But his first book was called The Case for Christ, because what happened was that Lee Strobel his wife converted to Christianity, and he was very challenged by the fact that his wife converted to Christianity, because he had always seen her as a very rational person, and he saw Christianity as something not rational. But then he also saw that after his wife became a Christian, a lot of things in her life began to change, and she became a much better person. And so, because he was wrestling with this, he decided to try to disprove Christianity. And he figured where better than to disprove the resurrection of Christ. So he examined that from multiple different angles. And what he found is what he published in The Case for Christ, which is that if you took all of the evidence for the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ and examined it in a court of law, then by the standards of evidence and by the standards of a court of law, you would actually have to conclude that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. And from that book has spawned a whole series of books by Lee Strobel that are the case for books, where he does the case for the resurrection. The case for the resurrection is by Gary Habermas, but he has the case for Christ. He has the case for a creator. Now he has the case for faith, the case for evangelism. So he has a whole series of books that he's done. The reason why I wanted to start with the case for a creator and not the case for Christ, even though I love the case for Christ a lot, is because I think that it's important for us to start with, we live in this modern world where a lot of people don't believe that there is a God. So I think it's important to kind of start there and refute even just that notion, and then move from there to build up the Christian case more and more. And by the way, I just want to point out that I think I have a slide about this a little bit later, but I do want to point out that I do think this is a little bit limited in scope. So in this particular case, even though I think Lee Strobel definitely does a great job and all of that, I do have a little bit of skepticism of the idea that Christianity itself can be proved scientifically, because God is outside of science. God is outside of the realm that is examinable in science. And so I don't believe that science can, quote unquote, prove God. What I do believe is that science, and certainly not the God of Christianity, the personal God of Christianity, I don't believe is something, although there is a chapter in this book where Lee Strobel and I can't remember which scientist it is, but they conclude that actually science does show this. And so we're going to go through that and we'll see if maybe they prove me wrong. But in my estimation, I think that the value of this sort of study is less in its ability to prove Christianity and more in its ability to disprove atheism. And then hopefully you guys will stick around and pay attention to my channel, and you'll see where I do prove, or where I do believe, or share things that I do believe prove Christianity. I don't prove anything. But you'll see where I share things that I believe do prove Christianity specifically. Anyway, so the book begins. If you know anything about Lee Strobel, you know that Lee Strobel likes to tie in stories into he has kind of a story element that works to make examples of things he's talking about. And so he starts this book out by describing a heroic clash that happened in West Virginia, in which a group of Christians stood firm and stood against the influx of heretical, false materials coming into their children's schools. Not even heretical, just straight up antichrist materials coming into their children's schools. But at the time, Lee Strobel was investigating this as a journalist. He was actually against the protests. He did not believe that they were in the right. He believed that they were these backwards people. And he describes the protests by saying that he essentially kind of had a very skeptical view of what was happening and thought that it was just these backwards people who were what does he say? He says, Darwin's theory of evolution, no absolute fact of evolution, meant that there is no universal morality decreed by a deity, only culturally conditioned values that vary from place to place and situation to situation. So what he's saying there is that he believed at the time that science had disproved Christianity and had disproved religion in general, and that people like these folks in West Virginia were just clinging to an archaic belief system and were basically just these dinosaurs of a forgotten age. And this is a fitting introduction to his book because it highlights the kind of battle over beliefs that we see happening here in America and in the West in general, wherein people have this conflict between what they believe that science is finding and what they believe that Christianity teaches. Now, I would say in good Orthodox form that what we need to do is examine both of those presuppositions, right? We need to examine what Christianity actually teaches. We need to re-examine our interpretations and discern whether perhaps the problem lies in us and not in Christianity. Have we misunderstood, say, sacred scripture or the fathers or what have you? Is that a problem with us as 21st century Westerners, or is the problem with the way people are interpreting science? Is science really contradicting scripture, or are we misinterpreting either science or scripture? Just recently, a friend of mine got very angry with me over a text message conversation that we had back and forth. And this is somebody who I've been very close to for a number of years now. And he completely misunderstood what I was saying in my text message and got very angry with me, thinking that I was sort of calling out some moral failing of his by just by sharing a discussion about some video. And I had meanwhile had no idea, or it hadn't even entered into my mind to consider that this video might touch on something that he was struggling with. I simply thought that the video was interesting and compelling and wanted to discuss it with him. So that just goes to show that sometimes, even when we really care about something, be it science or Christianity, we can completely misinterpret what we think we know. So, this is something that we have to work through. But at the end of the day, there's still this battle of beliefs, and there's still this question that stands. After we've re-examined our presuppositions, after we've re-examined our worldview, and after we've re-examined whether or not what we believe is being said by the science and by the scriptures is actually what's happening, once we've re-examined all of that, we still need to be able to come together and say, okay, so what is really going on here? What is the underlying problem? And can it be either reconciled or resolved? And if it does need to be resolved, then who is ultimately correct here? So the question is, do faith and science really contradict one another? For example, Lee Strobel says on page 18 of his book, I already read part of the quote, but he says that I knew intuitively what prominent evolutionary biologist and historian William Provine of Cornell University would spell out explicitly in a debate years later. If Darwinism is true, he said, then there are 5 inescapable conclusions. There is no evidence for God. There is no life after death. There is no absolute foundation for right and wrong. There is no ultimate meaning for life. People don't really have free will. These are, according to Provine, inescapable conclusions if you believe the modern theory of evolution or any of the sort of Darwin derivative theories of evolution. But is evolution, in this sense, is macroevolution? Because remember that everyone who studies science, whether Christian, atheist, whatever, all believe that there is such a thing as microevolution, that there is such a thing as development within animal species. The part that is debated, the part that is disputed, is whether there can be a change in kinds, whether, say, a dog and a cat can share a common ancestor, or a human and an ape can share a common ancestor. These sorts of changes in kind are actually what is at the heart of the debate. And is that macroevolution, and especially the idea that all living organisms share one single common ancestor, is that really a proven fact? Okay, so that's one question. Another question is, has science really put God out of a job? If we do follow the conclusions of science, as Provine says, does it really follow that there's no evidence for God, there's no life after death, and all these things? So those are the questions that this book is going to be addressing. Like I said, I love this book because I think that this book does a really great job of actually putting atheists on the defense. Atheists think that science is their friend, and that's why, in general, you see theists study philosophy and atheists study science. In general, obviously, there's atheists who study philosophy, and there's tons of theists who like to study science. So, as this book demonstrates, but what I mean is that sort of, if you look at a philosophy department, you'll find a lot more theists there than atheists. If you look at a science department, you may find a lot more atheists there than in the philosophy department, at least. Although still, I don't think that in the science department you'll find a majority of atheists. I don't think that's true. From what I've seen statistically, it's not. But you can show me in the comments if you have seen something more recent that would suggest that they are. But the point is that what I've seen happen time and again is that there are different disciplines within science and different kinds of evidence that are examined for different theories within different spheres of the scientific community. And what I find so fascinating is that in all these different spheres, there are Christians who are scientists and who believe that this particular discipline actually confirms some aspect of Christianity or of theology or whatever, and they'll write a book and it will seem very convincing. And inevitably what you find is you'll find atheists who will say, okay, I grant that area of science doesn't doesn't disprove Christianity or whatever, but we've got all this other stuff. So if biology turns out actually not to confirm macroevolution, and biology turns out actually to fit better with a Christian worldview than with an atheist worldview, that's okay because we still have chemistry. And if chemistry doesn't actually fit an atheist worldview, but actually fits better into a Christian worldview, that's okay because we have biology. But what Case for a Creator does that's so great is he takes he takes all these different disciplines and has experts showing that these things actually confirm Christianity rather than deny Christianity. And so it actually puts, with thoroughness, it puts atheists in more of a defensive posture. And so I think this is a really awesome book for that reason, because in every other discipline besides science, whether it's philosophy or whatever, linguistics, whatever it might be, you often find that secularism is on the defensive, which is why it's so aggressive. But in science, historically speaking, in science, in the last 200 years or so, secular people have felt like they were on the offensive, and Christians have felt like we were on the defensive. And this book turns that around and puts the secular minded folks on the defensive, which I think is good. So, like I said, we want to agree up front that there is such a thing as microevolution. For example, the Darwin famously used the example of the finch. There's different finches, and they have different beak shapes, and these things to find different prey and different food sources. And that doesn't go against Christianity, because Christians believe that there is such a thing as microevolution. Where we disagree is in the concept of Darwinism, or more broadly speaking, macroevolution. This is the real debate, the debate of whether a finch can evolve to become a person or a dog or a cat. I mean, okay, I know that that's a little bit of an oversimplification. Macroevolution doesn't teach that a finch becomes a dog, but you get what I mean. The idea that could you go back far enough and see that a finch and a dog spring from a common ancestor, Darwin's tree. This is what we're actually debating. This is where the rubber actually meets the road. So the reason why I think this is so important is because what I inevitably see when I discuss these topics is that atheists will show up in the comments saying something to the effect of, I don't understand what your issue is. Evolution is a proven fact. Look at this diagram about finches. And I'm going, okay, so where do the finches experience a change of kind? Where does this demonstrate that finches can become something other than finches? And it doesn't. And it inevitably does not demonstrate that finches can become something other than finches, or something other than birds, for that matter. Again, I'm saying become. I know that that's not exactly what macroevolution teaches. It more so teaches that over time, through tiny adaptations, you can have you can experience not that something becomes something else, but that something else sort of. I mean, it is at some point you have to have something becoming something radically different, because otherwise these things wouldn't be there. So you do have to have something giving birth to something else that, at least over the course of hundreds of millions of years, is completely other than what it started out as. That seems to be the only way that you can really have these things. So this, I think this is a good book for skeptics because it's a good place for people who are skeptical of the evolution paradigm. This book does a great job picking apart false theories and showing that these that like this these famous kind of diagrams, if you will, don't actually make any sense and are actually quite unscientific. This famous image where you see an ape and then you see an upright ape and then you see kind of an upright ape that's a little less hairy with a club, and then you see kind of a ugly looking dude with a spear, and then you see more like a modern Homo sapien is what they would say. And they say, well, see, this is what, but then does that actually show what really happened in history? Or is this a misrepresentation? Is this an oversimplification and misrepresentation of actual reality? So, but that's only half the battle, right? We also need to show what science seems to be positively demonstrating in opposition to these things, and that's the other thing that I think this book does a great job with. So the first thing we do is, and this will be where we start, Lord willing, next week, but it takes up the images of evolution. So we'll see how evolution has these various what he calls icons, like this ascending sort of graph here of the ape to the man, or Darwin's tree, or other images of evolution, and we're going to see whether or not those actually hold up to scrutiny. Then after that, we're going to examine, Stephen C. Meyer. And this is actually the same things that he discusses in his book, Darwin's Doubt, the Precambrian explosion. So we see that the fossil record actually does not evidence evolution. This is actually a huge problem for the theory of macroevolution. And it's a huge problem because even Darwin himself said that if the fossil record didn't demonstrate his evolutionary paradigm, then his theory would collapse. And time has shown that that has indeed happened. Another chapter in this book is going to cover cosmology. And we're going to ask the question, did the universe even have a beginning? Because historically, a lot of people actually believed that the universe didn't have a beginning, that the universe itself was eternal. And so if the universe did have a beginning, what caused that beginning to happen? And so in this, we examine the theory of the Big Bang, and we ask ourselves if the Big Bang is actually something that is confirming Christian truth claims, or if modern science has disproved Christianity. We're going to check that out. We're also going to look at physics and see the universe balanced on a razor's edge. So it's going to be discussing really the unlikeliness of life itself. And in that, we're going to see the rare earth kind of view, what makes it, why is it that life can exist at all? And from that comes the sort of fine-tuning argument that the parameters necessary for life itself and the parameters necessary for intelligent life in particular are actually very specific. And the likelihood that these things would happen on their own, unguided, is very, very astronomically low. So we're going to examine that. We're also going to examine Lee Strobel refuting or interviewing scientists who refute a false narrative of history. There's a false narrative that people used to believe that Earth was the center of the universe and was so important, and that science has over time humbled mankind. This is actually based in falsehood, because in reality, well, geocentrism was an ancient theory. People in the Middle Ages, for example, actually believed that Earth was kind of the sump of the universe, and where things kind of degenerated. And so the idea that the Earth was actually a heavenly body infinitely exalted the planet Earth and our place in the universe. And something like the Earth being in the actual center of the geographic center of the universe is something that was always irrelevant. That's never been something that, at least in Christian thought, was seen as a significant thing. So we're going to examine the fact that we live on a very privileged planet, that there may be no other planet like Earth for all we know. And we're going to see why that matters, and why that matters to the discussion of Christian truth claims in particular. And then my personal favorite argument in the book, and actually Cheryl's personal favorite argument in the book, is we're going to go from these grand, lofty concepts, these immense concepts of the immensity of the universe, and then we're going to bring it back to the microscopic level and talk about irreducible complexity. And like I said, this is Cheryl's favorite argument because she loves studying the microbiology in particular, but she really loves this idea of irreducible complexity as far as apologetics goes, because, and I do too, because really this demonstrates beyond anything else, beyond any reasonable doubt, that it is impossible for macroevolution to have happened, because there's no way that these systems could have formed over time. So that's something that we're going to examine. We're also going to examine the mind itself. To paraphrase Rene Descartes, we're going to see that I think, therefore God is. The very fact that man is a thinking creature is actually an argument for God. And speaking of thinking, I would like to humbly suggest that in all of these things, there are some limitations. There are limitations in, as an Orthodox Christian, I thoroughly believe there are limitations in what science can prove. I don't believe science can prove Christianity, and I don't believe this book by itself proves Christianity. Science is limited in scope because the human capacity for gaining knowledge is limited in scope. We can only study things to a certain level. There are things like metaphysics, philosophy, and theology that go beyond the boundaries of science. And I believe that we can have knowledge concerning things like the paranormal, things like religion, things like, we can have knowledge concerning these things, but we can't learn about those things through the discipline of science. We have to learn about those things through reason, through faith, through philosophy, and of course, through metaphysics. So I'm not saying that to discourage this kind of study, far from it. We are going to go through this book, and I am going to thoroughly enjoy it, and I hope you will too. But the reason why I share that is first and foremost because I thoroughly believe that especially Orthodox Christianity is something that has to be experienced. So I don't believe that we can prove God because God is not a um, God is not a lab test that you can prove. He's a person that you must know. So just like if someone asked me to prove to you that my wife existed, I would just laugh at their face. Like if somebody said, prove to me that your wife exists, I would just laugh. I don't need to prove that my wife exists. She's there when I wake up in the morning. She is my best friend, my closest companion, my deepest relationship, the love of my life. I don't need to do some science project to prove she's there. And my relationship to God is the same way, but you have to cultivate that relationship to God. You have to develop that relationship to God because that's how any personal relationship works. So, with all that said, I do want to share a little bit of a personal story as far as my science journey. I grew up really loving science. It was my favorite subject in school to study science, to study how planets worked and how the sun and how stars were and how stars formed, and microbiology and how the cell is organized and all these things. It was just my favorite thing in the world to study. However, when I got into high school in particular, um, the way science was presented was always in opposition to Christian truth claims. The things that were taught in science class, really, I say high school, but this even started in middle school. The things that were taught in science class were so diametrically opposed to Christian truth, to the scriptures, to um, a loving God who created the universe, that I thought that I hated science. I thought that I rejected science. I bought into the narrative that you could either have faith or you could have science. And I chose to keep faith and reject science because I thought science was just this horrible, unpleasant thing, and that everybody who was studying it was kind of had these false motives. And I really became very sort of skeptical and dejected regarding science. Then I got into college, and at Liberty University, I fell in love with science again because at Liberty University, their classes were so thoroughly scientific, so deeply, thoroughly in love with Jesus Christ, so thoroughly honoring to Jesus Christ. And this brought me back into the fold of being someone who loves science. Seeker Truth says science is not mistakes. At times it goes the wrong way before someone discovers a mistake. As a result, the scientific search for truth often leads to contradictions. Yeah, that's a good analogy there. So at Liberty University, even though I was in college, I learned how to be a kid again with regard to science. And that's what I hope that this book and our class on this book will help you to do as well. I hope that it will help you to fall in love with science and fall in love with science in such a way that honors God. But at the end of the day, what this class is really about is the concept of Darwinian macroevolution is false and theism is true. This class is here so that we can remove the excuse of the extreporous and learn a little bit about God. But I don't want you to just learn about God. I want you to learn to know God. And so that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, is so that you can fall in love with the God I love and you can come to know the God I know. And so that you can have a relationship with him in his holy church. So for Christians, I want this to be an opportunity for us to become like kids again, with wonder and to fall in love with science. For atheists, my purpose is evangelism. I'll just say that outright. My purpose, if you're an atheist or agnostic, is to get you to join the Orthodox Church, become a Christian, and reject your materialistic worldview in favor of real science, for one thing, but also in favor of a relationship with God. And for Christians, my purpose is to show that science really is awesome and that science really isn't against faith, but actually can help us to advance the faith, and that you can love science and honor God in science and glorify God in his creation. So I hope that you will join me on this journey together, and tune in next week for chapter 2, where we're going to go through images of evolution. That might end up getting broken into 2 parts. We'll see. But that's my goal. So thank you very much for watching. And please do share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. Really quick, Seeker Truth followed up saying, daily our papers publish new findings from some study that contradicts knowledge previously had. Well, if it was knowledge, then the new papers shouldn't contradict it. So it contradicts ideas that were previously held. And clearly those ideas were wrong if you're saying that they've been disproved. It's what we thought we knew, maybe, but apparently we didn't know. And see, that's the thing too about science. People act as though science gives us access to this perfect knowledge and that it can't be wrong. But that's simply not true. As Seeker Truth pointed out, science is an ever-evolving discipline, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I will see you guys next week, Lord willing, and God bless. Thanks for watching.